And it won't be my fault if we're not prepared. We must send a warning to the closest homesteads. I really don't know what will happen if this continues for much longer. Why not take coordinated action? Why not resort to what was recently suggested? A vigilance group, Milligan interjected quickly. The other shook his head and turned to Lonnie for support. But Lonnie did not offer any. Lonnie was observing that strong, sightless face, staring into it with a look of bitter hatred and intense intent. This change surprised Milligan so much that he didn't pay attention to the rancher's response, and immediately Selby's peculiar instinct kicked in. He looked from one person to the other with a puzzled frown, and when his red eyes finally landed on the foreman, that individual's entire expression instantly transformed into one of confusion. Milligan couldn't help but think of a schoolboy caught in some wrongdoing. First the confusion, then the attempt at innocent nonchalance, followed by stubborn sullenness. It was clear that Lonnie's conscience blinded him to the fact that the other person couldn't see. "What do you say, Lonnie? We can only leave it to the sheriff and stay on our guard." The foreman stumbled through his response, almost too eager. "Yes," he said, "definitely. We must stay on our guard. I think it would be wise to send night guards to the different stations." He stretched himself, trying to appear at ease. Then suddenly, he sat up straight, and a peculiar expression came into his eyes. Milligan noticed the half-smile and the sideways glance in his own direction. "Yes," he continued, now composed enough, "especially Willow Bluff." "Why Willow Bluff?" asked the rancher, feeling perplexed. "Why? Why? Because we're waiting to transport those 200 cattle to the coast. They're already sold, remember, and only those two ranchers, Jim and Lag Henderson, are in charge of them. It would be effortless for Red Mask's gang to steal them, and the station is so isolated. It's a good 20 miles from here." William Selby sat in thought for a moment. "Yes, you're right," he finally agreed. "We'll send out extra night guards, and you should assign 2 good, reliable men to Willow Bluff for a few days. Only completely trustworthy men, mind you. Make sure of it." Lonnie immediately turned to Milligan, his face glowing with a malicious grin, and the latter understood. But he was not prepared for the cunning trap that his arch-enemy was setting for him, and into which he was about to fall without delay. "How would it suit you, Milligan?" he asked. Then, without waiting for a response, he continued, "But there, I suppose it wouldn't be suitable to send you. You're not the type to handle horse thieves. It requires courage. It's tough work and calls for tough men. Pshaw!" Milligan's anger flared up in an instant. He forgot about caution and everything else in the face of the taunt. "I don't know that it wouldn't be suitable, Lonnie," he promptly retorted. "It seems to me your comments are ill-timed, coming from a man who should remember that I am capable of holding my own with most men, even those big enough to devour me." He realized his mistake even as he spoke, but he was burning with indignation and didn't care at all about the consequences, and Lonnie came at him. If the foreman's taunt had stirred him, it was nothing compared to the impact of his response. Lonnie crossed the room in a couple of strides, and his furious face was thrust close to Milligan's, and in a voice hoarse with rage, he gasped at him, "I haven't forgotten, and by God—" But he didn't get any further. A movement from the rancher interrupted him. Before he realized what was happening, the blind man was at his side with a grip on his arm that made him flinch. "Stop it!" he shouted fiercely. "Stop it, you fool! Another word, and blind as I am, I'll—" Lonnie struggled to free himself, but Selby held him with almost superhuman strength and slowly moved him away from his intended victim. "Hey, can you hear me? I won't allow any killing to happen in here unless I do it myself. Step back, damn it!" And Lonnie was slowly, despite his ongoing struggles, pushed against the wall. And then, as he continued to resist, Selby pressed the barrel of a gun against his face. "I'll shoot you like a pig if you don't comply." But the threatening weapon had an immediate effect, and the foreman's resistance faded weakly. The entire scene happened so quickly that Milligan simply stood in shock. The agility, the incredible certainty and speed of Selby's movements were astonishing. It all seemed impossible, and yet he had witnessed it. The stories he had heard about this man suddenly made sense. He was truly someone to be feared. The intimidating Lonnie was nothing but a puppet in his hands. Now, like a scolded child, he stood with his back against the wall, seething with hatred and rage. With Lonnie silenced, Selby turned to him. His words were brief, but sufficient. "And as for you, Milligan," he said coldly, "watch your tongue. I'm in charge here." There was a brief silence. Then the rancher returned to the topic that had sparked the conflict. "So, what about the men for Willow Bluff, Lonnie?" It was Milligan who answered the question without hesitation. "I'd like to go out there, Mr. Selby, especially if there's a chance of trouble." It was the only position available to him after what had just occurred, and he knew it. He glanced at Lonnie and saw that, at least for the moment, his animosity towards his employer had been set aside. He was smiling a predatory smile. "Very well, Milligan," the rancher replied. "And you can choose your own partner. Go and get ready. Lonnie," he turned to the other, "I want to talk to you." Milligan left, feeling that he had messed things up. He credited Lonnie for his cleverness, fully appreciating the unwavering hatred that fueled it. However, what occupied his thoughts the most was the spectacle the blind man had presented to him. He grinned when he recalled Lonnie's boastful threats to Heather. How feeble they appeared now. Yet the smile faded when he remembered that he still had to confront the rancher about his daughter, a delicate matter indeed. He vividly recalled Lonnie's mention of a tornado, and he headed towards the bunkhouse with rather dreary thoughts. Meanwhile, the two men he had just left remained silent until his footsteps had completely faded away. Then Selby spoke up. "Lonnie, you are a complete fool," he exclaimed abruptly. The foreman remained silent, prompting the other to continue. "Why can't you leave the boy alone? He's harmless, and moreover, he's valuable to us." "Harmless and valuable?" Lonnie laughed bitterly. "Oh, come on. Your blindness is affecting your judgment." "What do you mean?" "I mean it would have been better if you had allowed me to eliminate him. It would have been better for us. For you." "I don't understand. You're forgetting about his money." The blind man's voice was barely audible. "You're forgetting that he plans to purchase a ranch and livestock. You're forgetting that he has $25,000 to spend. Bah! You'll never become a successful businessman." "And what about your daughter?" Lonnie asked, completely unfazed by the other's explanation. "My daughter?" Selby chuckled softly. "You always bring that up." "He will leave my daughter alone. She knows my desires, and she will obey me. I couldn't care less about him or his affairs. But I want his money, and if you can just control your evil temper, we will obtain it. Your share will remain secure in this and all other transactions." It was now the foreman's turn to laugh, but there was no joy in it. It ceased as abruptly as it began, abruptly cut off. "He's gonna leave your girl alone, huh?" he said with a sneer. "Listen, do you know what he was doing around this house last night when he saw those horse thief guys, or should I tell you?" "You better tell me," replied the rancher coldly. "He was after your girl, and what's more, he saw her, and what's even more, she's promised to be his wife. He told me." "What? Say it again." There was an ominous calmness in the blind man's manner. "I said he was after your girl, saw her, and she's promised to be his wife." "Ah." Then there was silence for a few minutes. The red eyes frowned in the direction of the window. Finally, the man took a deep breath, and Lonnie, observing him, wondered what was about to happen. "I'll see her," he said slowly, "and I'll see him after he comes back from Willow Bluff." That was all, but Lonnie, familiar with William Selby's every mood, understood more than what the words conveyed. He waited for any additional information, but only received a curt dismissal in a sharp tone, causing him to hurriedly leave the room. Once he was clear of the porch, he walked more slowly, his eyes fixed on the bunkhouse. All the old hatred resurfaced within him as he saw Milligan turn the corner of the building and disappear inside. "Guess no one's going to see you after Willow Bluff," he muttered. "No one." Chapter 15. Milligan wanted to meet Heather before heading out to Willow Bluff, but upon further consideration, he realized it would be impossible, or at the very least, pose unnecessary risks for her. Given what he had recently witnessed regarding her father, it was essential for him to approach anything concerning her with caution. Therefore, he focused entirely on getting ready to leave. He had already decided on his companion without any hesitation. Arizona was his guy, and he sent the diplomatic Joe out to bring him in from Pine Creek swamps, where he was cutting late hay for winter supplies. In about half an hour, the American came in, full of curiosity and eagerness, and he wouldn't be satisfied until he had been told all the details of the matter that had led up to the appointment. Milligan kept back nothing but his personal matters concerning Heather. At the end of the story, Arizona's rising temper reached its peak in an outburst. "Say, that guy Lonnie is a mean pirate who would steal supper from a blind dog and then beat the hell out of him because he can't see." Having expressed his feelings, he became practical. "And you're going, you and me?" he asked incredulously. "That's the plan, Arizona, but of course you're free to do as you please. I chose you. Selby gave me the privilege of choosing." "Well, I guess we should get going. Willow Bluff Station is pretty decent, so we'll only need our blankets, food, and a good amount of ammunition. I think I'll go and see Teddy for the rations." He hurried off. Milligan watched him go. It was great to be dealing with a man like him after those others, Lonnie and the rancher. Arizona's way of accepting his selection pleased him. There was no back and forth about it, no argument, a silent acceptance and immediate consideration for their needs. A seasoned campaigner, a man to be relied upon in emergencies, a man to be appreciated. In 2 hours, everything was ready, with Milligan sending a comforting message to Heather through Joe. They rode off. Jezebel was behaving well, and Arizona's horse kept up with her fast pace with its cow-horse amble. As they reached the ford, Milligan stopped and got off his horse, while the other watched as he took out a wicker-covered glass flask from his pocket. "What's that?" he asked. "Whiskey?" Milligan shook his head and tried the metal screw cap. "No," he replied shortly. Then he leaned over the water and carefully set the bottle floating, pushing it out as far as possible with his foot while he supported himself by the overhanging branch of a tree. Then he stood watching it carried slowly downstream. Presently the improvised craft darted out with a rush into the current and swept onward with the main flow of the water. Then he returned and remounted his impatient mare. "That," he said as they rode on, "is a message. Files's men are down the river spying out the land and, incidentally, waiting to hear from me. The message I've sent them is a request for assistance at Willow Bluff. I have given them sound reason, which Files will understand." Arizona displayed considerable astonishment, which found expression in a deprecating confession. "Say, I guess I'm too much of the old hand. I didn't just think of that." It was all he said, but it conveyed a great deal, and the thin face and wild eyes said more. Now they rode on in silence, while they followed the wood-lined trail along the river. The shade was delightful, and the trail sufficiently sandy to muffle the sound of the horses' hooves and thus leave the silence unbroken. There was a faint buzz from the insects that haunted the river, but it was drowsy, soft, and only emphasized the perfect peacefulness of the woods. After a while the trail left the river and gently inclined up to the prairie level. Then the bushes broke and became scattered into small bluffs, and a whiff of the invigorating air of the plains brushed away the last smell of the fragrant glades they were leaving. It was here that Arizona roused himself. He was of the prairie, belonging to the prairie. The woodlands depressed him, but the prairie made him expansive. "Seems to me, Milligan, you're kind of taking a lot of unnecessary risks, meaning there's no more reason to it than whistling Methodist hymns to a deaf mule. Can't see why you're bothering yourself with these darn horse thieves. You're asking for a lot more than you can handle. And like all men of such condition, I will probably eat until I'm full, I suppose you mean." Arizona looked skeptically at the speaker and quietly spat over his horse's shoulder. "Guess your language isn't mine," he said thoughtfully. "But if you mean you're going to get your belly full, I reckon you're likely to feel stuffed like a rooster with a full crop before you're done. And I say, why?" Milligan shrugged. "Why does a man do anything?" he asked casually. "Usually for one of two reasons. I guess it's drinking or women." Again, he gave a speculative glance at his friend, and as Milligan showed more interest in the distant view than in his remarks, he continued, "I haven't heard that you were a heavy drinker." The person he was concerned about smiled at him. "Perhaps you think I'm a fool, but I just can't stand by and watch things go wrong in a way that threatens to overwhelm one poor, lonely girl whose only protection is her blind father." "Then it is women?" "If you like. But I don't quite see where those horse thieves come into play." "Maybe you don't. but believe me, they do indirectly." Milligan paused. Then he continued briskly. "There's no need to go into details about it, but I want to infiltrate this gang. Do you know why? Because I want to find out who this Red Mask is. It is on his character that the possibility of my helping the one person on this ranch who deserves nothing but gentle care from those around her depends." "Amen," Arizona added in the way he had learned during his religious days. "I must find a way to free her from Lonnie somehow." Arizona's eyes quickly flashed at him. "Exactly," he said in a complaining tone. "That's how I wanted to do last night." "And you would have messed everything up." "Completely wrong." "Perhaps so," Milligan smiled confidently. "We all make mistakes sometimes." Arizona's dissatisfied grunt was unmistakable. "That's just how that orange-colored beefy Joe Nelson got upset when Lonnie came around and found him sleeping off the previous night in the pig pen. But it didn't go any worse than his did, I suppose. Anyway, it's women. Say, Milligan." The thin figure leaned over toward him, and the intense eyes looked earnestly into his. "It's correct, then absolutely correct. When I've dealt with her father and Lonnie—" Arizona extended his rough, claw-like hand. "Shake," he said. "I'm glad, really glad." They gripped for a moment, then the cowboy turned away and sat staring out over the prairie. Milligan, watching him, wondered at that long period of deep thought. The man's face had a softened look. "We all fall prey to it sooner or later, Arizona," he ventured eventually. "It happens once in a person's lifetime, and it happens for better or worse. Twice for me." The harsh reality snapped Milligan's sentimental mood. "Ah." The other continued his examination of the horizon. "Yep," he said finally. "One died and the other didn't make it. I understand." It was pointless to offer sympathy. When Arizona talked about himself, when he chose to share his life's troubles with anyone, he had a way of stating simple facts as they were. He spoke of them because it suited his pessimistic mood. "Yep, the first one was a bit delicate, always had a weak back. I guess I got involved with her before I knew much. Must have been. Yep, she had peculiar ideas. Hated sharing a cup of tea with a friend. I remember seeing her scrape out a frying pan once. She had some odd quirks. I don't think she had much intelligence either. She could never tell a pig from a sow, and as for riding a horse, even hell itself couldn't have convinced her. She had a desire for sitting sideways and always became stubborn when you guessed she was wrong. Yep, she was passionate about social events and eating off of china, and wasn't satisfied with newspaper on the table. And she had the idea that she had pimples, and worried her husband until he bought a razor and transformed his face into a patch of freshly plowed land, and kind of coerced her mother into treating her stomach with some fancy remedy that wouldn't be found anywhere. And she was particular about her own eating habits, too. I guess some strange person had taken her to Sacramento and treated her to a meal at one of those Italian joints where they disguise almost everything with language, oil, and garlic until you despise yourself. Well, she died. Maybe she has all those things readily available now. But I'm not saying anything mean about her. She just had her peculiar ideas. I suppose it came from her mother. She was always interested in foolish things and fixings. Can't blame her, though. I guess I was mostly impulsive in those days. Love at first sight is a really good thing when it comes to saving effort. But like all labor-saving contraptions, it's prone to getting messed up sometimes, and then there's no predicting what will happen. Arizona's mood was very hopeless, but soon he perked up visibly and resumed chewing his tobacco. "The other one was a bit slower in coming along," he continued in his thoughtful drawl. "But when it arrived, it was strong and true. You see, there was an arrangement between us that made us friendly. She cooked for the roundup, which I suppose, when a lady is young, she's usually an object of affection for the boys. Guess she was almost every kind of a girl, with her hair the color of a field of wheat ready for the combine, and her figure as delicate as one of those fancy egg boilers, and her pretty face all sparkling with smiles and horse soap, and her eye. Wow, but she had an eye. Guess she would have made a prairie rose hate itself. But that was before we got together as a team. I reckon marrying is a pretty bad ending to courting." "You were married?" "I was." A silence fell. The horses ambled on in the fresh midday air. Arizona's look was forbidding. Suddenly he turned and gazed fiercely into his friend's face. "Yes, indeed. And in my opinion, despite what some folks say, getting married is most like making butter. Courting is the cream, good and thick and juicy, and you can lay it on thick, and you kind of wonder how those old cows got the understanding to produce such excellent liquid. But after the turning point, which is marrying, it's different. It's not cream anymore. It's butter, and you need to use it sort of harshly. That's how I found out, I suppose." "I suppose you settled down and things went all right, though," suggested Milligan. "Well, maybe that's true. I guess if anything was wrong, it was me. You see, there aren't many fellas who really understand females. I'm usually patient. Knowing their weakness, I say, 'Arizona, you're mud when women are around. Being married, it's your duty to support the girl.' So I just let her sit around and give orders as though I was the hired man. Say, I bet you've never had a girl giving orders. It's really sweet to hear them, and I think they know what they're doing mostly. It makes you feel as though you had half a dozen hands, and they were all reaching out to get to work. That's how I felt anyway. Every morning she'd gently persuade me out of bed before daylight, and I'd feel like a hog for sleeping late. Then she would shovel the orders quickly, in a voice that would put molasses to shame. It was always dear or darling. First, haul water, then chop wood, light the stove, feed the pigs and chickens, clean out the old cow's stall, fill the lamp, brush down the horse, tidy up the kitchen, start boiling the clothes, cook the food, and do a bit of laundry while she took a short break. Then she would get around, usually around noon, with her shower of hair trailing like a rain of gold dust, and a stylish silk robe that she called a dressing gown. She would sit right down and eat the food, telling me about things she wanted done that she had forgotten. The chicken coop needed to be whitewashed. She was sure the chickens had bugs, and the horse's harness needed fixing so she could drive into town. The wagon needed to be washed and the wheels greased, and the seat was a bit hard and needed a cushion. Then there was the potato patch that needed hoeing, and the cabbages, and the hay mower needed to be prepared for haying. She usually drove that herself, and I must admit I was glad. Arizona paused and took a fresh chew. Then he continued, "I suppose you have never gotten married?" Milligan denied the accusation. "Not yet," he said. "Huh, I guess it makes a big difference." "Yes, I suppose so. Settles a fellow down. Makes him feel like settling down. Well, maybe." "And where's your wife living now?" Milligan asked, after another pause. "Can't really say." There was a sharpness in Arizona's response. "You see, it's like this. I suppose I didn't amount to much as a married man. At least that's how she saw it after a while. I guess I was always a mean guy, and she was really happy cooking meals. I suppose I drove her to drinking at the saloon, too, which made me hate myself even more. Well, I just did what I could to smooth things and keep going. I got punching cows again and gave her every cent of my wages, but it wasn't meant to be." The man's voice was hoarse, and he paused to compose himself, and then hurried on as though to get the story over as soon as possible. "Guess I was out on the roundup for some weeks, and then I come back to find her completely gone. Maybe she had gotten lonely. I can't say. Yeah, the shack was empty, and the wagon gone, and the blankets, and most of the cooking supplies. It was the neighbors who informed me. Neighbors mostly inform you. They acted friendly. There had been a guy from Alberta, a pretty tough breed guy. He went by the name of Tough McCulloch." Milligan started, but Arizona was still staring out at the distant prairie, and the movement escaped him. "Guess he had been around the shack a lot," he continued, "and the day before I got back, the two of them had driven out with the wagon loaded, taking the trail for the hills. I went after them but never found a trace. I reckon the guy had guts. He left a message on the table. It was one of his guns loaded. You probably won't understand, but I kept that message. I haven't seen her since. I did hear that she was cooking hash again. I reckon she could cook hash. Say, Milligan, I've lost pigs, and I've lost cows, but I'm guessing there ain't nothing in the world meaner than losing your wife." Milligan made no reply. What could he say? Tough McCulloch. The name rang in his ears. It was the name Anton had been known by in Canada. He tried to think what he ought to do. Should he tell Arizona? No, he dared not. Murder would promptly be done if he knew anything of the American. No doubt the breed deserved anything, but there was enough savagery at Fly Bend without adding to it. Suddenly another thought occurred to him. "Did you know the man?" he asked. "Never laid eyes on him, but I suppose I will someday." And Milligan's decision was firmly confirmed. "And the gun message?" "Well, it's a way they have in Texas," replied Arizona. "A loaded gun is a kind of challenge. It's a challenge that isn't for the present exactly. I reckon it holds good for life. It means on sight." "I understand." And the rest of the journey to Willow Bluff was made almost in silence. The impressive expanse of the blind man's territory now became apparent. They had traveled 20 miles almost directly, and yet they had not reached its boundaries. As Arizona said, in response to a comment from his companion, "The horizon is not a limit for the blind hulk's land." Willow Bluff was, as its name suggests, just a large wooded bluff standing at the intersection of two rivers. To the south and west, it was open prairie. The place consisted of a small cabin and a group of large pine log corrals capable of housing 1,000 head of livestock. And as the men approached, they saw the peacefully grazing cattle scattered over the nearby prairie, which were to be their responsibility. "A pretty bunch," observed Arizona. "Yes, and a pretty place for a raid." At that moment, the actions of the raiders were foremost in Milligan's mind. Then they proceeded to take possession. They found Jim Henderson, a menacing-looking mixed-race boy, in the cabin and promptly put him to work cleaning it out. It was not in bad condition, but the boys had let it become filthy, in the usual manner of all mixed-race individuals. However, they quickly rectified this, and Milligan saw a quite respectable prospect of comfort for their stay there. Arizona said very little while there was work to be done, and his companion was amazed, even though he knew him so well, at his capability and foresight. Evening was the most crucial time, and here the rancher excelled in his expertise. The cattle had to be corralled every night. There could be no chance of them straying, as they were sold and could be transported at any moment. This task, along with the job of counting, required all the rancher's skill. Groups of 50 were gathered, separated from the rest, and quietly brought in. Once each corral was filled and the entire herd settled for the night, they were given a fresh supply of hay to keep them occupied during their remaining waking hours. Arizona was a master at this work, and observing his agile, lean body swaying back and forth as he maneuvered his well-trained horse around the calm herd, using his arms and lasso, gave insight into the untamed life that captivated him and his wild, untrained nature. The final corral was secured, and only then did the two friends relax. "Well," said Arizona, as they stood leaning against the bars of the largest corral, "do you think there will be a night guard?" "Yes. These guys seem smart enough. We'll let them take 2 hours until midnight. You and I will handle the rest." "And all of us will sleep around the corrals?" "That's right." "And the horses?" "We'll keep them saddled." "And the sheriff's men?" "I can't say. We probably won't see them anyway." And so the plans were made, simple yet seemingly futile. Two men, since they couldn't rely on the mixed-race individuals to face any odds if the raiders chose this location to attack. But no matter how inadequate the guard may be, there was something morally strong in the calm, natural way it was arranged. These two knew that if trouble arose, they could only rely on themselves, yet neither hesitated or questioned the task. Possibilities never factored into their calculations. The first and second night didn't cause any concern. They also didn't receive any unsettling news. On the third day, Jacob Smith rode into their camp. He was a patrol guard, visiting the outlying stations. His news was peaceful enough. "I don't care at all how long the old man keeps worrying," he said with a cheerful laugh. "Let me tell you, this job is easy. I ride around like a general, spying for enemies. Red Mask has his uses." "So do most people," responded Arizona, "but it's not always easy to locate them." "Well, I think I can locate his whereabouts pretty soon. I'm kind of inactive, which isn't usual on Fly Bend." "I guess not. He's treating us differently." "Ah, doing night guard duty? Say, I'd rather see a blind hulk roast than hold on to those beasts. But that's like you, Arizona. You hate him worse than hell, and Lonnie, too, yet you'd shaw." "So long. I suppose I should get going. I have nearly 40 miles to cover before I get back." And he rode away, carefree, oblivious to the very real danger. and that was the life they all led. They asked for pay, a place to sleep, and food. Nothing else mattered. Milligan had a sense that the whole thing was more of a formality than a serious matter, that he had acted too hastily in sending his message to the sheriff. He wanted to return to the ranch. He understood all too well how he had unknowingly helped Lonnie's plans, and bitterly cursed himself for being so easily deceived. He was conveniently out of the way, and the foreman would make sure he stayed that way for as long as possible. Arizona, too, had become anything but cheerful. He went about sullenly and snapped angrily at the boys. There was no response to the message sent to the sheriff. They searched the bluff every day for any sign, but with no luck, and Milligan was more relieved than disappointed, while Arizona seemed completely indifferent on the matter. The third night brought a small surprise for Milligan. It was midnight, and one of the boys woke him up for his shift. He sat up and, to his surprise, found Arizona sitting on a log next to him. He waited until the boy had gone to bed. Then he looked at his friend questioningly. "What's going on?" And Arizona's response shocked him. "Hey, Milligan," he said, in a tired voice that was completely different from his usual assertive manner. "I just wanted to ask you to switch shifts with me. I've been having trouble falling asleep. Maybe I'm getting weaker. I reckon I might get sleepy later on, and I thought, maybe if I were to do the first shift, well, you see, I guess that pain in my chest hasn't been good for me." Milligan immediately stood up. It suddenly occurred to him that this peculiar prairie dweller was unwell. "Nonsense, man!" he exclaimed, his tone revealing his concern. They were at the entrance of the large enclosure, concealed in the shadow cast by the tall wall of horizontal logs. "You go and go to bed. I'm going to keep watch until daylight." "Well, that's really kind of you," remarked the other, unperturbed, "but it's no use. I don't think I could sleep yet." "Well, suit yourself. I'm going to keep watch until daylight." Milligan's manner was calmly determined, and Arizona seemed to accept it. "Well, if it pleases you that way, I'll just sit around until I get sleepy." Milligan was genuinely worried, but he shrugged with a feigned indifference and walked away to do a circuit of the enclosures, carefully staying in the shadows of the walls as he went. After a while he returned to his position. Arizona was still sitting where he had left him. There was a moment of silence for a few minutes. Then the American quietly pulled out his gun and spun the chambers around. Milligan watched him, and the other person, looking up, caught his eye. "I guess these things can be tricky," he explained. "I had it jammed once. It's a good weapon, but not for fixing. This one," he continued, taking out a second gun from its holster, "is a 6-shooter that can take down an ox at 50 yards. It has a quick trigger. It's really great. I think it used to belong to Tough McCulloch. Don't you have yours on your hip?" Milligan shook his head. "No, I use a belt for my pants and keep the guns loosely in my pockets when I'm not riding." "Wrong. You should fix them properly." "You take too many chances," the American replied with a laugh. Milligan complied jokingly. "I'm not likely to need them, but still." "Nope." Arizona returned his guns to their resting place. Then he looked up. "Hey, I think I arranged the horses differently. Our horses. I brought them up and placed them in the corner where this corral connects to the next one. It seems better, more convenient. It's sheltered, and there's a bit of a cool breeze. One of those early frosts." He looked up at the sky. "I guess we shouldn't have. There won't be a moon until almost daylight. Anyway, no point arguing about the weather." Milligan was closely observing his companion. There was something strange in his demeanor. He seemed almost imaginative, yet there was a remarkable alertness in how quickly he spoke. He remained silent, and soon enough the other person continued, but he had switched to a new topic. "Hey, I never asked you how you plan to deal with Lonnie," he said. "I guess it'll all—" He paused and glanced out towards the prairie, but continued almost immediately. "Be settled. I've seen you get angry, and I've seen Lonnie." He stood up and peered into the darkness while speaking in a steady, unvarying tone. "Yep," he continued. "There are ways of dealing with men, you know. I mean, if you were dealing with an honest person, you would just talk to them respectfully. Mind you, I think I know you pretty well." His eyes suddenly shifted to the man he was talking to, but quickly returned to the serious contemplation of the vast grasslands. "You would argue the point reasonably and let the girl settle the matter for you. But with Lonnie, it's different." He slowly reached for his right hip, and suddenly he turned to his friend with a look of desperation. "Do you know what will happen between you two? This is what it means." And he pulled out the heavy revolver that had once belonged to tough McCulloch, aiming it straight ahead. Milligan thought it was aimed at him and stepped back, while Arizona laughed. "This is what will happen. You'll take careful aim, and if you have friends around, they'll ensure fair play for sure. They'll count 3 for you, like this. Just 1, 2, and you both shoot on the last, like this. 3. There was a flash, a loud bang, and then a cry pierced the quiet night air. Milligan lunged at the man whom he now believed to be insane, but the cry stopped him, and in the next moment, he felt Arizona's strong hand gripping his arm, dragging him around the enclosure as the sound of horses' hooves thundered towards them. "It's them!" That was the only explanation Arizona provided. They reached the horses and both quickly mounted, and the American's voice whispered hoarsely, "Get low. I think these walls will protect us, and we have a clear view of all the corral gates. Understand? Shoot carefully and aim accurately, and be cautious on the bluff. The sheriff is nearby." And now, the inexperienced Milligan understood the entire plan. He was filled with admiration for his comrade's brilliant strategy, and he thought he was crazy, his mind twisted. For some reason he believed the attackers were approaching, but not being completely sure, he had found an excuse for not going to bed as usual, and concealed all his suspicions for fear of causing unnecessary panic. And their current position was a carefully planned strategy, the only viable one from which they could hope to gain any advantage, for protected, they still had every entrance to the enclosures within shooting range. But there was little time for contemplation or speculation. If the sheriff's men arrived, great. In the meantime, a group of 12 men had charged toward the enclosures, a silent, eerie gang. The only sound they made was the noise of their horses' hooves. Both men, observing, were leaning over their horses' necks. Arizona was the first to shoot. Once again his gun released a deadly shot. Milligan saw one figure stagger and collapse with a moan. Then his own gun was heard. His aim was less effective, only provoking a volley in response from the attackers. That volley was the signal for the true battle to commence. The hiding place of the 2 defenders was discovered, and the rustlers split up, sweeping around to launch their attack. But Arizona was prepared. Both horses swiftly changed direction and raced out of their makeshift fort, and Milligan, following the quick-thinking man, admired his resourcefulness as he darted into another corner between 2 other enclosures. The darkness worked in their favor, and the rustlers raced past. Arizona only waited for them to be well clear, then his gun rang out again, and so did Milligan's. But the game was over. A straggler spotted them and sounded the alarm, and immediately the rest pursued them. "Around the enclosures!" As he spoke, Arizona turned in his saddle and fired into the crowd. A barrage of shots was returned, and the bullets whizzed all around them. He remained as calm and composed as if he were hunting jackrabbits. Milligan joined him in a fresh barrage, and 2 more saddles were emptied. But the next moment, a gasp told Arizona that his comrade was hit, and he turned just in time to prevent him from falling out of the saddle. "Hold up, man," he cried. "Keep your seat if all hell breaks loose. I'll keep them occupied." And the injured man, driven by a similar determination, sat upright while the 2 horses raced on. They circled back to the front once more. However, even though Arizona kept his promise, emptying and reloading his gun repeatedly, it was a futile struggle from the start. Milligan was bleeding severely from a neck wound, and his aim was becoming increasingly uncertain. Nevertheless, his willpower fought hard to overcome his physical weakness. Just as they headed towards the bluff again, Arizona abruptly pulled on his reins, causing his pony to rear up onto its hind legs. The Lady Jezebel, too, as if coordinated with her partner, suddenly came to a halt. The reason for the cowpuncher's actions was a lone horseman standing directly in front of them, gazing out at the bluff. The plainsman swiftly raised his gun, despite the pursuers behind him. Death glinted in his eyes as he took aim, but in that moment, a shout came from the bluff, and the cry was echoed from behind him. "Sheriff's posse!" That cry cost him his opportunity to bring down Red Mask. Before he could pull the trigger, the horseman had spun around and disappeared into the darkness. Simultaneously, the pursuers veered out, turned, and within moments They were in full retreat under a barrage of gunfire from the sheriff's men, and as the latter pursued hot on their heels, Arizona called out to them, "You've missed him. He's taken to the riverbank. It's Red Mask. I can see him." However, now Milligan required all of his friend's attention. Arizona witnessed him tumble forward and cling desperately to his saddle horn. Reacting swiftly, he rushed to his aid, dismounted, and carefully lowered him to the ground. He then released his own horse, guiding the Lady Jezebel by her reins while providing support for the ailing man as they made their way to the shack. Upon arrival, his patient promptly lost consciousness, but Arizona remained composed and resourceful. Assessing the wound, he identified a severe tear in the neck from which blood was slowly spurting. Recognizing the imminent danger posed by the proximity of the injured artery to the jugular, he understood the gravity of the situation. Though his medical expertise was limited, he managed to rudimentarily clean and bandage the wound. Resolutely, he reloaded his guns and, aided by a strong dose of whiskey, revived his patient to a semblance of consciousness. Aware that this revival would only be temporary, Arizona was determined to mount him onto the back of the spirited Lady Jezebel. Accomplishing this task proved to be quite challenging, as the mare understandably resisted the additional weight. However, the desperate cowpuncher possessed the knowledge and skill to handle her. Only someone as audacious as Arizona would dare to attempt such a feat with a horse of her nature. Yet he knew that speed was crucial if he were to save his friend's life, and he had faith in the Lady Jezebel's ability to deliver it. Chapter 16. As the sun began to rise, the exhausted Lady Jezebel and her heavily loaded carriage sped toward the ranch. The horse had completed the journey in exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes. Arizona rode her swiftly towards the house and circled the shed where Joe slept. Then he halted abruptly and yelled. In that moment, he had no concern for the ranch owner or Lonnie. His only focus was on Milligan. His third yell prompted Joe to quickly emerge from his bed. "Listen, I have a seriously ill man here," he exclaimed as soon as he heard the laborer stirring. "Get over here and give me a hand, nice and easy." Joe, barely awake, questioned, blinking up at the horseman in the dim light. "Is that you, Arizona? And before I start answering any foolish questions, let me grab hold of this idea. Red Mask has been spotted around Willow Bluff, and Milligan's been attacked. You understand?" "Milligan, did you say?" asked a girl's voice from the kitchen entrance. "Injured?" There was a world of fear in her whispered questions. Arizona lifted Milligan down into Joe's arms. "I didn't realize you were there, miss," he replied, without turning away from his task. "Be careful, Joe. Take it easy now. He's very sick, I suppose." "Yes, miss, it's him. They've scratched him up a bit. It's nothing to panic about. Just grazed his neck. He needs a bandage. Damn you, Joe. Put your arm under his shoulders and keep his head steady. He'll bleed to death if you're not careful." "Quiet, you stubborn horse," he cried fiercely, to the mare who was startled by Heather's white robe as she came to assist. "No, miss, not you," Arizona exclaimed. "He's covered in blood and all messed up." Then he noticed that she was only wearing a nightgown. "Gee, you're not properly dressed, miss. Just get right in." "Well," as she deliberately proceeded to help the struggling Joe, "if you insist. But I think Joe can handle it. There, that's it. I can get off this crazy horse now." As soon as Arizona dismounted, he took over from Heather, and with the utmost gentleness began to carry the sick man into the lean-to. But the girl objected immediately. "Not in there," she said firmly. "Take him into the house. I'll go and prepare a bed upstairs. Bring him through the kitchen." She spoke in a surprisingly calm manner. Too calm, Joe thought. "To that house?" Arizona protested. Yes, of course." Then the floodgates of grief opened, and Heather cried, "And why not? Where else should he go? He belongs to me. Why are you standing there like a fool? Take him immediately. Oh, Jack, why aren't you speaking? Oh, take him quickly. You said he would bleed to death. He isn't dead? No, tell me he isn't dead. Dead? Dead? Ha, ha!" Arizona threw all the scorn he was capable of into the words, and laughed with somber seriousness. "Say, that's really good, really good. Him dead? Well, I guess not. Pshaw. Say, miss, you're not asking about my health, and I'm thinking I should be sicker than him with that horse of his. Say, just go ahead and prepare that bed for him, like the amazing woman you are. What about your father, miss?" "Never mind, father.
Come along." The man's attempt at lightheartedness had its effect. The girl pulled herself together. She understood the urgency. She knew that Milligan needed her assistance. Arizona's demeanor had only highlighted the seriousness of his condition. She ran ahead, and the other, carrying the unconscious man, followed. "Never mind, Father," Arizona muttered uncertainly. "Well, here goes." Then he called back to Joe. "Get around that horse and put the saddle on a fresh horse. I think I'll need it." He walked through the kitchen, and entering the hallway, he was startled by the sight of the blind man standing in the doorway of his bedroom. He was wearing his usual robe, and his eyes glowed brightly in the light of the kitchen lamp. "What's this?" he asked sharply. "Milligan has been attacked," Arizona immediately replied. "I suppose the gang gathered at Willow Bluff. May God's curse fall upon them." "Ha! And where are you taking him?" "Upstairs," was the brief response. Then the cowboy remembered his duty to his employer. "I suppose the cattle are safe, for which you can thank the sheriff's gang. Miss Diane is preparing a bed for him," he added. Despite his usual confidence, Arizona never felt at ease with this man. Now the rancher's demeanor noticeably softened. Yes, he said gently. "Take the poor boy upstairs. You'd better go get the doctor. You can give me the details later." He turned back into his room, and the other person went up the stairs. They laid the sick man on the bed and pointed out to the girl the bandage on his neck, advising her to readjust it practically. Then they quickly left the house and rode into Falls for Dr. Osler, the veterinarian, the only available doctor in that area. When Heather found herself alone with the man she loved lying before her, motionless, like someone dead, her first instinct was to sit down and cry for him. She could handle her own problems with some strength, but seeing this strong man weakened, possibly dying, was different, and her feminine vulnerability was close to overwhelming her. But even though tears filled her eyes, her love gave her the courage she needed, and she approached the task Arizona had pointed out. With skilled fingers, she removed the soaked bandage, from which blood was slowly seeping. The renewed bleeding alarmed her, and she quickly got to work. Now she understood as well as Arizona did what was wrong. She hurried to her own room and returned swiftly with materials for rebandaging and her arms full of clothes. Then, with utmost care, she proceeded to bind up the neck, placing a cork on the artery below the cut.
She secured it tightly enough that, at least for now, the bleeding stopped. With her goal achieved, she started to get dressed, ready for the doctor's arrival. She had taken her place by the bedside, contemplating what else could be done for her patient, when an unexpected event occurred. Someone was ascending the stairs, moving cautiously, as if feeling their way. It was her father, the first time in her memory that he had visited the upper part of the house. A look of alarm appeared in her eyes as she stared at the door, waiting for his arrival, and she fully understood the potential outcomes of the situation. What would he say? What would he do? A moment later, she confronted him with calm bravery. Her fears had been suppressed by the knowledge of her lover's helplessness. A single glance at his beloved, unconscious figure had accomplished for her what nothing else could have achieved. Her duty as a daughter vanished like a flame snuffed out with wet fingers. There was not even a glimmer remaining. William Selby crossed the threshold, and his head slowly turned as if to determine where his daughter was sitting. The oil lamp seemed to capture his blind attention, and his gaze fixated on it, but only for a moment. Then his eyes moved on until they settled on the girl. "Where is he?" he asked coldly. "I can hear you breathing. Is he dead?" Heather jumped up and leaned over her patient. "No," she said, partly fearing that her father's question was foretelling. "He is unconscious due to blood loss. Arizona." "Tcha! Arizona! I want to speak with you. Here, give me your hand and guide me to the bedside. I will sit here. This place is unfamiliar." Heather did as she was told. She was pale. A tense expression was in her gentle brown eyes, but there was determination in the way her lips were set. "What is wrong with you, girl?" her father inquired. The softness of his tone did not mask the coldness of his manner. "You're trembling." "There's nothing wrong with me," she replied pointedly. "Ah, thinking of him." His hand reached out and rested on one of Milligan's legs. His statement seemed to require no response, and silence fell as Heather observed the eyes so intently focused on the sick man. Eventually, he continued, "These men have done a great job. They have saved the cows. Arizona mentioned the sheriff. I don't know much about it yet, but it seems to me this boy must have arranged for their help. Smart work if he did so." "Yes, Father, and courageous," added the girl in a soft voice. His words had given her hope, but with his next statement, he shattered it. "Courageous? It was his responsibility," he snapped, immediately resentful. The red eyes were turned towards his daughter, and she thought she saw something incredibly cruel in their pained depths. "You seem unusually interested," he continued slowly. "I was warned before that he and you were close. I informed you about it and cautioned you. Isn't that enough? Or do I have to?" He left his threat unfinished. A blush slowly spread across Heather's cheeks, and her eyes sparkled. "No, it's not enough, Father. You have no right to prevent me from speaking to Mr. Milligan. I have accepted your decision regarding the other men on the ranch. There, maybe you had a right, a parent's right. But it's different with Mr. Milligan. He is a gentleman. As for his character, you yourself admit it is beyond reproach. So what right do you have to refuse to let me even talk to him? It's ridiculous, tyrannical, and I refuse to obey you." The furrowed brows sharply lowered over the man's eyes, and Heather understood the sudden emergence of a storm behind his expressionless face. She waited with a desperate calmness. It was the moral courage prompted by her newfound love. But the storm held back, controlled by that indomitable will that made William Selby feared by all who came into contact with him. "You are an ungrateful girl, a foolish girl," he said calmly. "You are ungrateful for refusing to obey me, and foolish for thinking of marrying him." Heather stood up. Tut, don't protest. I know you have agreed to be his wife. If you denied it, you would be lying." He sat for a moment, enjoying the girl's discomfort. Then he continued, with a cruel smile on his lips as she returned to her seat, almost collapsing. "That's better," he said, following her action with his incredible intuition. "Now let's be rational, very rational." His tone had become persuasive, as if speaking to a child, and the girl wondered what further cruelty it concealed. She didn't have to wait long. "You're going to give up this madness," he said coldly. "You will show yourself open to reason, my reason, or I will enforce my demands in another way." The girl's frustration grew with each passing moment, but she remained silent, waiting for him to finish. "You will never marry this man," he continued with quiet emphasis, "nor any other man while I'm alive. There is no marriage for you, my girl. There can be no marriage for you, and the more unimpeachable a man's character is, the less likely it is." "I don't pretend to understand you," Heather replied, as cold as her father. "No, perhaps you don't," the man chuckled wickedly. Tears welled up in the girl's eyes. She could no longer hold them back, and with the tears came the protest that she couldn't suppress. "Why can't I get married? Why am I not allowed to get married? Surely I can claim the right of every woman to marry the man she chooses. I know you don't have any goodwill towards me, Father. Why, I can't understand. I have always obeyed you. I have always tried to do my duty. If there has never been any great affection shown, it's not my fault. Because for as long as I can remember, you have done your best to extinguish the love I would have given you. How have I been ungrateful? What do I have to be grateful for? I can't recall a single act of kindness you've ever shown me. You've created a barrier between me and the outside world of this ranch. I feel like a prisoner here. Why? Am I so detestable? Do I not have any claim to your tolerance? Am I not your own flesh and blood?" "No!" The man's response came with overwhelming force. It was the eruption of his unleashed passion, a storm that his will could no longer contain. But that was the extent of it. Heather was the next to speak. Her cheeks turned pale, and her trembling lips made it difficult for her to articulate her words. "What do you mean?" she gasped. "Oh, your stubbornness drives me to this," her father impatiently replied, though he maintained perfect control. "Oh, don't worry. There's no legal disgrace for you, but there is something that will hit you much harder, I believe." "Father, what are you saying?" Some of the man's implications were starting to become clear to her. His words brought back old insinuations and suggestions about her mother. Her throat grew dry as she stared at the unyielding face of the man who was still her father. Saying, "You know the story of my blindness. You know I spent 3 years visiting almost every eye doctor in Europe. But what you don't know, and will soon know, is that I returned home to Jamaica at the end of that time to find that I had become the father of a 3-day-old baby girl." The man's teeth were clenched, rage and pain contorting his face, making his sightless gaze grotesque. "Yes," he continued, but now more to himself, "I returned home to that, and just in time to hear the final words your mother spoke before she died, just in time to witness her death struggle." He savored his words with unmistakable relish and fell silent. Heather recoiled with a bitter cry. Her cry awakened her father. "Well," he pressed on, "you're going to give up on this guy now?" For a few minutes there was no response. The girl sat still like a statue made of white stone, and her face had the same unfeeling expression as the shape of her features. She felt cold in her veins. Her mind couldn't function properly, and her heart seemed crushed within her chest. Even the man lying sick on the bed next to her held no significance to her. "Well?" her father asked impatiently. "You're going to let go of Milligan now?" She heard him this time. Everything rushed to her at once, and a feeling of complete helplessness overwhelmed her. Oh, the embarrassment of it all. Suddenly she threw herself onto the bed and sobbed her heart out beside the man she had to give up. He had been the only source of light in her otherwise dreary life. His love, which had come so unexpectedly and quickly, had made the memories of her unloved years fade away. The happiness she had experienced with him overshadowed the pain of her past. And now, it all had to end. She convinced herself that there was no other option, and in this decision, her father's wickedness became evident. He understood her pride in being honest, even if he didn't appreciate it. Then, without warning, she felt resentment and hatred towards the one responsible for her misfortune, and she sat up with tears still wet on her cheeks. Her father's lifeless eyes were fixed on her, and their hateful depths seemed to be searching her soul. She knew she had to comply with his wishes. He controlled her just as he controlled everyone else. "It's not what I want," she said softly. "I understand. Our paths must diverge." Anger then caused her tone to turn harsh. "I would have given him up willingly if I had known. I couldn't have burdened him with the shame of my birth. But you have kept this from me all these years, saving it in your heartless way for such a moment as this. Why have you told me? Why do you keep me by your side? Oh, I hate you." Yes, of course you do," her father said, quite unaffected by her attack. "Now you are experiencing a taste of the bitterness in my life, and it is good that you should. The sins of the parent affect the children. Yes, you can definitely understand." "For heaven's sake, leave me," the girl interrupted, unable to bear the taunting and the repulsive pleasure of the man. "Not yet. I haven't finished. This man—" The rancher leaned over the bed, and one hand felt its way over Milligan's body until it rested over his heart. "At one time I was glad he came here. I had reasons. His money was as good as in my pocket. He would have bought stock from me at a decent profit. Now I have changed my mind. I would sacrifice that. It would probably be better. No, he is not dead yet. But he may die, right, Heather? It would be better if he died. It would save you the trouble of explaining to him. Yes, let him die. You are not going to marry him. You wouldn't want to see him marry someone else, as he surely will. Let him die. Love? Love? Well, it would be a kindness to yourselves. Yes, let him die." "You wretch!" Heather was on her feet, and her eyes blazed down upon the cruel working face before her. The cry was literally forced out of her. "And that is the man who is willing to give his life for your benefit. That is the man whose intelligence and bravery you even praised. You want me to deny him the little help I can offer him. You are a monster. You have separated us, but that's not enough. You want his life." She suddenly leaned over and grabbed her father's hand, resting on Milligan's chest, and pulled it away. "Let go of him! Don't touch him!" she shouted in a frenzy. "You're not—" But she couldn't finish her sentence. The lean, strong hand had closed tightly around hers, holding them both firmly, causing her to cry out. "Listen," he said angrily. He, too, was now standing, and his tall figure made hers seem small. He will be moved out of here. I will have Lonnie take care of it in the morning, and you will know what it's like to defy me if you dare to interfere." He abruptly released her hands and turned away, but quickly turned back when he heard her response. "I will take care of him," she said. "You won't." The girl laughed hysterically. The situation had been too overwhelming for her, and she was on the verge of breaking down. "We'll see," she called after him as he left the room. The entire ranch was buzzing with activity when Arizona returned with Doc Osler. And they weren't alone. Files had encountered them on the trail. He had just returned from a fruitless pursuit of the raiders. He had personally tried to track down Red Mask, but the rustler had eluded him in the dense bushes along the river, and his men had been equally unsuccessful with the rest of the gang. The hills had been their destination, and they had successfully reached them due to their fast horses. Although the pursuers were well mounted, their horses were heavier and fell far behind in the rugged terrain of the foothills. Lonnie was in a private meeting with the rancher when the doctor and his companions arrived, but their discussion was immediately interrupted. The doctor went to the injured man, who still remained unconscious, while Files joined the rancher and his foreman in a discussion of the night's activities. And while these things were happening, Arizona and Joe enjoyed the ranch's hospitality. The meeting in the rancher's room had not gone far when a summons from upstairs interrupted it. Heather brought a message from the doctor asking her father and the sheriff to join him. Selby showed unusual speed, and Files followed him as he made his way up to the sick room. Here the cane was left behind, and he was guided to his seat by his daughter. Heather looked pale but alert and determined, while her father appeared genuinely concerned. The doctor was standing by the window, looking out over the fields, but he immediately turned as they entered. "A serious case, Mr. Selby," he said as soon as the rancher had taken his place. "A very serious case." He was an abrupt little man with a pair of sharp black eyes, which he focused on the blind man curiously. "An artery cut by a bullet. Small artery. Your daughter skillfully stopped the bleeding, many thanks to her. The patient lost a significant amount of blood. The situation was precarious. No danger from the wound now. Only exhaustion remains. If he were to bleed again, it would be fatal. But he won't. The artery has been securely tied. Miss Selby suggests moving the patient to the usual quarters. I say no. Moving him would risk the artery breaking open again, resulting in death. Sheriff, I am clearly ordering that this man remains where he is. Am I correct? Do I have the authority? Undoubtedly. Then Files turned to the blind man. His orders are your obligation, Mr. Selby, he said, and you, of course, will be held accountable for any violation of them. The blind man nodded in agreement. Good, said the doctor, rubbing his hands together. There is nothing more for me to do now. I will return tomorrow. Miss Selby is an excellent nurse. I wish I were the patient. He will be up and about again in 2 weeks. The artery is small. He's in good health and young. Oh, yeah, definitely no worries. Just exhaustion. I hope you apprehend the criminals. Good morning. Might have almost cut my throat while shaving. Dr. Osler nodded to the girl and passed out, muttering, Great nurse, beautiful. His departure made the rancher stand up, and he felt his way to the door. As he walked past his daughter, he paused and gently tapped her on the back. Oh, child, he said, with a lot of understanding and kindness in his voice. I still think you're wrong. He would have been much better in his own room, in his familiar surroundings, and with his friends. You're inexperienced, and these men know about gunshot wounds just like any doctor. But have it your way. I hope you don't end up regretting it. All right, Father, Heather replied, without taking her eyes off her sick boyfriend. And Files, standing at the end of the bed, observing the scene, cleverly speculated about the relationship between the girl and her patient, and the possible disapproval from her parents. He certainly had no idea about the events that had led to the need for his official services to enforce the doctor's orders. Chapter 17. Heather was not at all satisfied with her small victory. She had achieved her goal, it is true, but she had achieved it using methods that offered no promise of a happy outcome for her purpose. Left alone with her patient, she had little to do but contemplate her situation, and her thoughts brought her many sighs, much heartache and anxiety. She didn't allow herself to think much about her own well-being. She had already made up her mind about her future, Her love was going to be taken away from her just as the enchanting allure of it had begun to take hold. Every hope, every little dream she had built in her youthful thoughts had been mercilessly destroyed, and the view of her future was nothing but a bleak, hopeless expanse of gray. It was the outdated order emphasized, and the agony of it gripped her heart with every moment she devoted to contemplating it. Fortunately, the life she had lived had strengthened her. She was not the girl to cry at every misfortune that occurred. The initial shock had brought her to tears, but that had passed. She possessed the resilience to endure suffering and face the world without shedding a tear, gracefully concealing the bitterness of her situation and concealing her own pain by earnestly attempting to assist others. Milligan was her everything, and that everything meant much more than mere earthly love. To her, he was something to be cherished as a valuable gem entrusted to her care, and his honor was more sacred to her than her own. Therefore, all personal considerations had to be disregarded, and she had to let him go. However, if his honor was safe under her protection, his personal safety was a different matter. By opposing her father's wishes, she fully realized the danger she was exposing herself to. Therefore, she strained her overburdened brain to think of the best means to safeguard her charge. She was uncertain of what she feared. She couldn't think of any actual danger, but her instincts warned her to be watchful and prepared for anything. She was confident that her father would attempt to find a way to evade the sheriff's order. What form would his attempt take? After pondering intensely for half an hour, she resolved to seek the counsel of her wise old adviser, Joe, and enlist his assistance. With this goal in mind, she descended the stairs and went to the lean-to. There, she found both Arizona and Joe. Arizona was awaiting a summons from the rancher, who was still occupied with Lonnie and files. Initially, she considered confiding in her advisor privately, but ultimately decided to involve both men in her confidence, especially since she knew her lover had a fondness for the impulsive cowpuncher. As she entered, both men stood up. Arizona quickly removed his hat. "Guys," the girl said immediately, "I've come to ask for a little help." "That makes me happy, miss," said the cowboy eagerly. Joe simply looked up to ask a question. Heather nodded, pretending to be cheerful. "Well, here's the thing," she said. "Jack can't be left alone for the next few days. I'm his nurse, but I also have household chores to do, and will have to leave him sometimes. Arizona, you won't be able to do anything during the day because you're busy on the ranch. But Joe, I thought you could help me by being in the kitchen as much as possible. You see, in the kitchen you can hear any noise coming from upstairs. The room is right above. That way I'll be free to take care of the house." "Did you have trouble taking him upstairs?" Joe asked slowly. "Dr. Osler said something before he left." Heather turned away. The wise old eyes were reading her like a book. "Yes, Dad wanted him put in the bunkhouse." "Ah," Joe's twisted face took on a curious expression. "Yes, I think I can do that. What about nighttime?" "Oh, I can stay up with him. The night is fine," the girl replied casually. "I think we should take turns," Joe suggested. "No, that wouldn't work." "I guess it wouldn't. That's true," the other said thoughtfully. "However, I can sit in the kitchen at night. I won't need any lights. You see, with the door open right into the hallway, I'll hear any sound." The man's meaning was clear, but the girl refused to accept it. "No," she said. "I need you during the day." "During the day? I suppose that's settled." Joe looked up dissatisfied. At this point, Arizona chimed in with his own idea for being useful. "Hey, miss, if you ever need the doctor, just tap on that window real hard and I'll know you're calling for him. I'll come right up and get instructions. I'll be waiting around," the man said. The girl stared directly into his eyes, trying to understand the hidden meaning behind his words. But the man's expression was enigmatic. She felt that these rough individuals, instead of acting as advisors, had taken on the responsibilities she had only sought their help with. "You both are good guys. I can't thank you enough, but you've relieved a burden from my mind," she expressed. "No need for thanks, miss. I reckon a doctor is mighty necessary when someone's sick," Arizona commented calmly. "Especially at night," Joe added seriously. "I'll go back to my patient," Heather said abruptly. As she hurried away towards the house, the men heard Lonnie's heavy footsteps coming from the lean-to, and they understood the urgency of her departure. In the next moment, the foreman summoned Arizona to the rancher's presence. Heather had made a wise decision in seeking the help of these men. Without their assistance, it would have been impossible to take care of Milligan. She feared her father, and rightfully so. What would be easier for him than to remove her from the picture and have Lonnie move the patient to the bunkhouse? She knew that doc. Osler's threats of life or death had been exaggerated to support her argument, and she was fully aware that her father understood this as well. He was not the type to be frightened by such tales. Moreover, his parting words, so gentle and kind, only deepened her distrust towards him. Throughout the day, with Joe's help, she remained at the sickbed. Milligan was never left alone for long, and whenever it was absolutely necessary to leave, Joe's attentive ears strained to catch any alarming sounds. In addition, without Heather's permission, his eyes remained fixed on the hallway, observing the rancher's bedroom door. He had no hesitation in admitting his fears to himself. He had pried the whole story of the rancher's anger at Milligan's presence in the house from his young mistress, and also he understood that Heather's engagement to her patient was known to her father. Therefore his sharp eyes never closed, his sharp ears were always listening, and he moved about with a gun in his pocket. He didn't know what might happen, but his movements conveyed his opinion of the man they had to deal with.
Arizona had been sent with files to Willow Bluff. There were wounded men there to be identified, and the officer wanted his help in examining the battlefield. "But he'll get around tonight," Joe had said, after bringing the news to Heather. "Definitely as pine wood breeds bugs." And the girl was satisfied. The day wore on, and night brought no new anxiety. Heather was at her post, Joe was alert, and though no one had heard of Arizona's return, twice in the early hours, the choreman heard a footstep outside his lean-to, and he made an intelligent guess as to whose it was. The second and third day passed satisfactorily, but still Milligan displayed no sign of life. He lay on the bed just as he had been originally placed there. Each day the blunt little doctor drove out from Falls, and each day he went back, leaving little encouragement behind him. Before he went away, after his third visit, he shook his head gravely in response to the nurse's eager inquiries. "He has to get busy soon," he said, as he returned his ointments and medical supplies to his bag. "Don't like it. Bad, very bad. Nature exhausting. He must wake up soon or die. 3 days, tut-tut. Still no sign. Cheer up, nurse. Give him 3 more. Then drastic treatment. Won't come until he wakes up, no use. Send for me. Good girl. Stick to it. Sorry. Goodbye." And giving Heather a pat on the back, the man hurriedly left in his erratic manner, leaving her in tears over the decision he had left behind. It was the stress of watching that had unsettled her. She was physically and mentally exhausted. Her eyes and head throbbed from the seemingly never-ending vigil. 3 days and nights with barely 6 hours of sleep overall, and those only taken in broken intervals. And now another night lay ahead of her. She was so overwhelmed that she even considered accepting the help that old Joe had offered. She seriously contemplated it for a few moments. Couldn't she sneak him upstairs after her father had finished his dinner and retired to his bedroom? She had no idea that Joe had secretly spent almost as much time keeping watch as she had. However, she didn't come to a definite decision and wearily went downstairs to prepare the evening meal. She served the blind man in her usual patient, silent manner, and afterwards returned to the kitchen to face the long, dreary night. Joe was finishing the dishes. He took longer than usual, although he had become remarkably skilled in his cooking duties since he was first hired on the ranch. Heather paid little attention to him, and as soon as her part of the work was done, she prepared to go upstairs. "There's just the sweeping up, Joe," she said. "Once you finish that, we're done. I have to go up to him." Joe glanced over from the sink, but continued working. "Hasn't he shown any signs, Miss Diane?" he asked eagerly. "No, Joe." The girl spoke almost in a whisper, leaning against the table with a deep sigh of fatigue. "Hey, Miss Diane," the little man suggested softly. "That doctor guy said maybe he'd give him 3 days. That's a really long time. It seems to me that you'll need to be awake and active around that time." "Oh, I will be awake and active, Joe." The old man shook his head doubtfully, and he moved away from his trough, drying his hands, and came over to where she was standing. "Listen, I just can't sleep at all. That's just how I am, I guess. I have spells. I was thinking maybe I would just stay up. A good night's sleep would fix you right. I've heard that people can influence their patients. You being tired, sleepy, and miserable, maybe that's what's keeping him back." Heather shook her head. She saw through his indirect deception, and its kindness touched her. "No, no, Joe," she said almost affectionately. "Not on your life. You would give me your last bit of food if you were starving. You are doing everything, and more than anyone else would do for me, and I will not accept anything more." "You're thinking wrong," he replied quite harshly. "It's not for you. No, it's for him. You see, we're relying on him, Arizona and me." "For what?" the girl asked calmly. "Well, you see, it's like this. He's going to be a farmer." "Yes, don't you see?" he asked, with a pitiful attempt at a knowing smile. "No, I don't." "Listen, maybe Arizona and I will get a nice little job, eh?" "You are talking nonsense, and you know it." "What?" The little man stood embarrassed at the girl's tone. "You're only saying all this to get me to sleep tonight instead of staying up? Well, I'm not going to."
"You're thinking about money and such things. Oh, Joe, it's almost funny." Joe's face turned red as much as it could. "Well," he said, "I just thought there was no point in both of us staying up." "Nor is there. I'm going to do it. You've made me feel quite refreshed with your silly talk." "Ah, maybe. I guess I'll clean up." Heather understood the suggestion and went upstairs, her eyes filled with tears. In her current state of unhappiness, Joe's complete selflessness was more than she could handle. She took her place at the bedside, determined to stay there as long as she could stay awake. Then she would keep watch in the hallway. For an hour, she fought against sleep. She kept her eyes open, but her senses were dulled, and she spent the time in a kind of dream. A disturbing, imaginative dream, where Milligan was lying lifeless on the bed next to her, and she was experiencing the agony of realization. She mourned him, continuing to live her monotonous life under her father's roof, listening to his daily insults and enduring his deliberate cruelties. No doubt this waking dream would have continued until she fell asleep without realizing, but after an hour, something happened to fully awaken her. There was a clear movement on the bed. Milligan had suddenly lifted one arm, which then quickly fell back onto the bedsheet, as if the spasmodic movement had been uncontrollable by any mental or physical power. She was on her feet in an instant, leaning over him ready to administer the medication's doc. Osler had left for her, and in the light of the shaded lamp, she noticed a noticeable change in the paleness of his face. It was no longer deathly pale. There was a hint of life, albeit faint, in his sunken features, and as she saw it, she wanted to cry out in joy. She gave him the restoratives and returned to her seat with a rapidly beating heart. Suddenly she remembered with alarm how close she had been to falling asleep. She stood up abruptly and started pacing the room. The moment was crucial. Her lover could regain consciousness at any moment. And with this thought came a surge of caution. She went out onto the landing and looked at the top of the stairs. Then she quietly returned. An idea had come to her. She would block the entrance, and although she didn't admit it to herself, it was the memory of her father's blindness that motivated her. Grabbing 2 chairs, she positioned them at the top of the stairs in a way that even a slight accidental touch would cause them to fall. The plan appealed to her. Then, fearing sleep more than ever, she stationed herself on the landing, checking on the sick room with every turn she took. The hours dragged on painfully. Milligan showed no further signs of waking. It was past midnight, and the girl's eyes could no longer stay open. In addition, she frequently stumbled as she paced back and forth. In desperation, she brought the lamp from the sick room and entered her own room, splashing cold water on her face. Then she busied herself with tidying up the place, anything to keep herself awake. Eventually, feeling better, she sat on the edge of her bed to take a break. It was a fatal error. Her eyes shut despite her best efforts. She was defenseless. Nothing could have prevented it. Exhaustion took hold of her and she fell asleep, and Milligan was stirring. His body had begun to recover, and the restorative Heather had given him was doing the rest. He shifted several times, but his strength was still not enough to fully awaken him. He lay there with his mind fighting against his overwhelming weakness. Thoughts were swirling amidst the haze of dreaming. He was vaguely aware that he was lying on a bed, yet it felt as if he were bound by unyielding iron restraints that resisted his most frantic attempts to break free. It seemed as though he was struggling fiercely, and Lonnie was there, taunting him. Finally, completely exhausted and worn out, he gave up attempting and reached out to Arizona. He yelled loudly, but he couldn't hear his own voice. He shouted over and over again, increasing the volume of his screams to a terrifying level. But still, no sound was produced. Then he believed that Lonnie had departed, leaving him completely alone. He lay motionless, waiting, and soon he realized that he was lying on the prairie, restrained by shackles that secured his hands and feet to the ground. And the moon was shining, and he could hear the distant sounds of the coyotes and prairie dogs. This made him fully comprehend the situation. His adversaries had orchestrated this scheme so that he would be devoured alive by the famished scavengers of the prairie. He contemplated for a long time, pondering, as the cries of the coyotes drew nearer, how much time would pass before the first repulsive creatures would pounce on him. Now he could discern their figures in the moonlight. They approached slowly, gradually. One considerably larger than the others was leading, and as the creature drew closer, he noticed that it had the countenance of the rancher, whose sightless eyes glowed like two fiery coals in the moonlight. It stood upright on its hind legs, and to his complete astonishment, as this man-wolf stood peering down at him, he observed that it was clad in the robe that the rancher always wore. It was an eerie apparition, and the shackled man felt the power of those savage, gleaming eyes gazing so cruelly into his own. But there could be no resistance. He was entirely at the mercy of the creature. He saw the glistening teeth exposed in anticipation of the impending feast, but, with cunning reminiscent of a wolf, it dissimulated. It circled around, scanning in all directions to ensure the absence of any danger. It paused and stood listening. Then it advanced. Now it stood near him, and he could feel the warmth of its foul breath wafting onto his face. Lower bowed its head, and its front paws, which he recognized as hands, were placed on his neck. Then a faint and distant voice reached him, and he knew that this man-wolf was speaking. "So you'd marry her," it said. "You. But we won't take any risks. I could tear your throat out, but I won't. No, I won't do that. Just a little blood, that's all." And then the dreaming man felt the fingers moving around his throat. They felt cold and clammy, and the night air chilled him. Then came a change, one of those amazing changes that dreamland loves, and which drives the dreamer, even in his sleeping thoughts, almost mad. The dark view of the prairie suddenly lit up. A great light shone over everything, and the dreaming man could see nothing but the light and the wolf man. The eerie creature stood its ground. The fingers were still at his throat, but now they moved uncertainly, groping. There was no longer the deliberate movement of determined purpose. It was as if the light had blinded the cruel scavenger, making its purpose fail by suddenly destroying its vision. It was a breathless moment in the dream, but the tension quickly eased. The hands were abruptly drawn away. The wolfman stood upright again, and the dreamer heard it speaking to the light. The words were gentle, in contrast to how it had spoken to him, and the softness of its tone captivated him. "He's getting better, huh? Waking up," he said. And somehow the dreamer thought that he laughed, and the unseen coyotes laughed with him. A brief silence followed, which was eventually broken by another voice. It was a voice from within the light, and its tone was a gasp of astonishment and alarm. "What are you doing here, Father?" the voice inquired. There was a strange sense of familiarity in the tones, and the dreamer struggled to remember. But before it came to him, the voice continued with a wild exclamation of horror. "Dad! The bandage!" the dreamer wondered, and something caught his attention about the wolfman. He noticed that the creature was glaring at the light with a fierce determination in its expression. It all felt so real that he felt a surge of excitement as he waited to see what would happen. But the voice from the light spoke again, and he found himself listening. "Leave," it said in a commanding tone, filled with horror and anger. "Leave, or if you dare touch me, I'll smash the lamp in your face. Leave now, or I will call for help. It's nearby, an armed help." There was a pause. The wolfman stared at the light with wicked eyes, but the planned attack did not happen. The creature muttered something that the dreamer couldn't hear. Then it moved away, not in the same manner it had arrived, but stumbling blindly. A moment later, the light also went out, the howls of the coyotes silenced, and the moon illuminated the scene once again. And the dreamer, still feeling trapped, watched the large yellow sphere until it vanished below the horizon. Then, as darkness enveloped him, he seemed to fall asleep, as the scene faded away and his memory vanished. Chapter 18. The sun of the early morning was pouring in through the window of the sick man's room when Milligan finally regained consciousness. And, interestingly enough, more than half an hour went by before Heather noticed the alteration in her patient. And yet she was fully awake as well.